I'm here representing myself. I'm not representing the Navy. Thanks for doing that. I'm certainly not representing the Top Gun Squadron. A little background about why I'm doing this. I was an F-14 Rio, radar intercept officer. Rio, that's the backseater like Goose in the movie Top Gun. And then as a lieutenant, I was fortunate to be selected as an instructor at the Top Gun Squadron. I had a 20-year career in the Navy, had a lot of great flying, and then when I retired in 1999, I wrote a book about this, and it's called Top Gun Days, and that's shown, whoops, that's shown right there on the inset in your screen. I'll use that inset if it's useful as we go along with the discussion. Before I go any further also, I would like to thank the people that helped to get us here at this point. We'll call him the producer of this program, Ben Gavaris. I've got tech support, Alex Rideout, Vitaly Kachin, Blake Setnar, and John Carr. These guys have spent a lot of hours and burned up a lot of emails and a lot of electrons to get us to this point.
Thanks, guys.
Today's session is going to have 4 basic parts. One is the main topic for the session, and today we're going to talk about preparing for your fighter mission. The second section is going to be answering questions. Some questions have been submitted in advance. I've got my laptop here. If we get questions during the webcast, then I can check those. Third question is going to be a few stories about squadron life, and the fourth section is going to be recommendation of an aviation book. We're going to go for about an hour. If I finish in 20 minutes, then I'll just tell more stories, but I won't go too much longer than 1 hour. So the first part of my topic is preparation, preparing for your fighter mission. Now, I'm aiming these talks, I'm aiming this whole session at video gamers. And in fact, the guys who have helped me set this up, they fly DCS.
Yep.
But I also realize that there may be other aviation enthusiasts who watch this, but it helps me to focus my remarks at this specific audience. So video gamers, they have fun getting in the plane. That's the way I'm going to think about it, and taking off and flying. It's fun. They get to see amazing things, and in fact, for me, that was one of the fun parts about being an F-14 Rio. I mean, I loved flying. I like flying in the airplane. I like playing with clouds. I like looking at the world from 5,000 feet or 35,000 feet, wherever I was, or 200 feet. And there's a lot of fun for that. But these, as I understood it, or as I realized, and as these DCS participants realize, there comes a point when you want to get more serious about it, when you want to either challenge yourself, you want to make it more complicated, more involving. And so that's why, that's what we're going to talk about here. That's going to be one of our basic things. Of course, the Navy realized this very early on. The Navy has extensive training before they even let anyone get into a fighter jet. You have to go through flight school in Pensacola. For Rios, they stay in Pensacola a little bit under a year. And then pilots go to Pensacola briefly and then move to one of the pilot training squadrons, and pilots go through almost 2 years of training. Then you go to the specific squadron where they teach you about your specific jet, and that's called a RAG. RAG originally stood for Replacement Air Group or Readiness Air Group, and in fact the term was officially replaced, and it's now it's called an FRS, or Fleet Replacement Squadron, but everybody still calls it the RAG. Some people call it FRS. The focus of the RAG early on was standardizing operating procedures and applying lessons learned for safety considerations. And if you are familiar at all with aviation history, or if you've done much reading about it, then you'll know that aviation was incredibly costly in the 1950s in terms of mishaps. Number of airplanes lost, number of people killed. And the services, the Navy, the Air Force, Marine Corps, and the Army all realized they could not sustain this. One, planes were getting more expensive, but two, they did not want to keep killing these people. And so everyone began various programs to improve their aviation safety record. And one of those programs was the RAG or FRS program. So they focused on operating procedures, standardizing, etc. And also in the Navy, the RAG is where an aircrew comes out and they are ready to go into combat. Once they leave the RAG, they go to their operational squadron, and they could be on deployment, and they could go into combat within days or certainly weeks after leaving the RAG. Now, the Navy takes, goes through effort to try to select people who already have some experience, some time in the airplane, but if necessary, they can send RAG graduates into combat. The other thing is that, of course, the RAG, the whole RAG syllabus, the whole RAG effort has evolved over the decades since the RAG concept began. And now the RAGs do a lot more tactical training, and they, in the Navy at least, they apply a lot of lessons and a lot of the teachings from the Topgun program or from the NSOC, Navy Strike and Air Warfare Center. Because they realize we might as well start training these guys the right way at the very beginning. People go on, people learn from experiences, and they start to apply those experiences at an earlier and earlier stage in everyone's training. So the whole point is that by the time an aircrew gets into an actual frontline fighter jet, they've already gotten a lot of training and a lot of experience. Now, what I'm going to tell you is a few specific things to help you as a DCS person to have get some similar benefits out of this. One of these things is exploring the limits of your airplane. When we think of the limits of the airplane, a lot of people think top speed, highest altitude, and things like that. But as I learned from tactical flying, and remember, I was a Rio, but still, I was right there 6 feet behind the pilot, and I was responsible for the performance of our airplane. And the Navy has an excellent culture of professionalism where both crews are responsible for the complete performance. So as I learned is it's often more difficult to fly slow than it is to fly fast. And so the very first flight of the Topgun program, when I went through the program, was a performance demo. And I remember, we had a lot of fun. We got out there and we did an acceleration demo. On my performance demo, we fought an F-14A, which I was in, against an F-5E. We did a level acceleration demo, full, 3, 2, 1, go to max afterburner, straight and level. The F-14 went a little bit ahead of the F-5. Then we did an unloaded acceleration, which is where you reduce reduce drag associated with lift by unloading the airplane, go to full burner, and the F-14 zoomed out ahead of the F-5.
Because it's heavy.
A great advantage. No, because they had more power.
Oh, okay. So that's actually really interesting to hear you say that, because that's typically whenever I buy an aircraft in DCS, the first thing I do is get into it, throw the throttle on, open the throttle as fast as I can, and then go turn around. But I guess I never think about trying to take it and compare it to other aircraft, or actually take it down to stall speed and see how it actually acts.
Well, that was, and the guy who's talking is Ben Gavaris.
Oh, so sorry.
That was what you first think of is, let's drag race these things and see which one's faster. But the thing that I remember I remember that, but one thing that I enjoyed the most was the slow speed handling demo. And that was the F-5E goes to maneuvering flaps, the F-14 goes to auto flaps, and we tried to see who could fly the slowest. I mean, I'm using my hands, but I actually do have a couple of models on sticks here. I don't know how much I'll use these today. And in my performance demo, the F-14 was on the left side of the formation. And so the F-5 pilot, we just started slowing down, and we both got up, I don't know, probably we were 30 degrees nose high or more, flying at about 120 knots.
Wow.
Anyway, slow, maybe 150, but less than 150. We were at maneuvering flaps. The F5 was at maneuvering flaps also.
Wow.
Now, something to think about, and this was very important in the F-14. Why would we do the acceleration demo first? To burn gas.
Oh.
Yeah. So you want to do the acceleration demo because if you're heavy, if you've got a full bag of gas, it doesn't matter as much. But when you fly slow, you're going to get even slower if you're in a lighter airplane. So, I mean, and they thought of all these things when they decided, okay, what are we going to do first? What are we going to do second?
That's planning.
So that was a good way to explore the limits of the airplane. We also did max performance turns. We did, roll, pitch, and things like that. All the basics. Why do you do this? Because one of the fundamental lessons of Top Gun, and one of my takeaways from today is you have to be aware of your aircraft strengths and your weaknesses and the opponent's strengths and weaknesses. Now, there's a corollary to that, which I'll bring up later. But in the F-14, for example, one of the known weaknesses of it was it did not have a very good roll rate. And so when an F-14, and we were fighting against, let's just keep it with the F-5, the F-5 had a much higher roll rate. So if we were doing a merge, 180 out, then the F-5 sometimes would reverse at the merge and act like he was going to turn one way, hoping that the F-14 would turn that way, and then if the F-5 chose, he could reverse again.
Really?
Yeah, and hope that the F-14 may have lost sight or something like that, because the F-14 could not make two reversals like that very quickly. It was just a known flaw or a limitation of the airplane. And so that's a tactic that F-5s would sometimes use doing a 1v1. They try to start to turn across your tail. You would turn your plane to counter them, and then they would reverse, thus making you change your game plan.
I'm glad I recorded you saying that.
Okay. On the other hand, the F-14 had a great pitch rate. And so once we started the turn, or if we got in certain regimes in, for example, a rolling scissors or something like that, the F-14 had a very good pitch rate. And that allowed the F-14 to use that in maneuvers and it was better than the F-5.
So you could load the wing up faster.
Yeah, the nose would transit faster.
That's right. I guess that really makes a lot of sense when you're in a turning fight.
Now, when I was putting notes together for this, I did some research in history, and I've got a couple of books here, and I'll stick these in front of the camera. And just one is an old book. I'm sure you can't get it anymore. Oh, that's good, Ben. Aces and Aerial Victories: An Air Force History of Combat in Vietnam. Another is an old book also called Fighter Combat. That is still available. And these books talk about a great historical situation, and that was air combat in the Vietnam War. And so when I'm talking about flying to your strengths and your opponent's weaknesses, think about the big, heavy F-4 Phantom. Mach 2 airplane, big, heavy, sophisticated weapon system. And it's out there dogfighting with little MiG-17s. MiG-17s, light, probably not even supersonic, simple weapon system, and they were challenging in a close turning engagement. Why were the Phantoms in that engagement? Because the rules of engagement prevented them from using their long-range Sparrow missiles. I mean, it's actually a great case study for air combat. And the Vietnam War still has a lot of lessons to teach us on a lot of, regarding a lot of topics. Ben, is that warning something you need to work about?
Oh,
just look on that. Not a big deal.
No, it's not Skype. I'm sorry.
Okay. So we're talking F-4s versus MiG-17s.
why was the AIM Sparrow, or why was the Sparrow missile hindered so much during that though?
You know, I could have paid you to ask that question.
No, because I've heard bad things.
Okay, I'll tell you a couple of things about the F4 and the Sparrow.
Okay.
And you know, this is one of the benefits of being an old guy.
Yeah.
When I was a teenager, before I was a teenager, when I was reading aviation books, magazine articles, this stuff was brand new, and so it was real life, real time. Think about the design of the F4. Came about in the late 50s. The intent was to make a high-speed, sophisticated missile-armed interceptor. People had an idea. You know, it went 1,600 miles an hour. It had the Sparrow missile, which was long range for the time. It had a good radar for the time. Very impressive airplane. The Navy and everybody thought that there was going to be basically no more dogfighting anymore, and that everything was going to be missile kills. So when the Navy was training its air crews, they really de-emphasized maneuvering engagements, and they spent a lot of effort training for those missile engagements. Now, that's a complicated scenario. It's difficult to do it correctly, so it took a lot of time out of the training program. Then they bring the Phantom into Vietnam, and Navy and Air Force both experienced this. American forces had a difficult time sanitizing the airspace in front of fighters, and so they could not verify that a target was an enemy aircraft. So in most cases, and that's what, you know, this book, Aces and Aerial Victories, this has a lot of great stories where Phantoms had radar contact, but they could not clear to fire. Navy did the same thing. This happens to be a lot of Air Force experiences. So what does that do? The Phantom has this fantastic weapon system and the Sparrow missile, but it can't use it. They were not allowed to shoot until they visually identified the target as hostile, as a MiG. That puts them oftentimes inside the minimum range of the missile. See, all missiles have a minimum range. And for the Sparrow, the minimum range, especially at the time, was kind of significant. There's some reasons for that. The nature of the electronics took a longer time to warm up, to acquire the target, things like that. I mean, so the minimum range was significant. You couldn't just shoot with a Sparrow. You couldn't shoot at a target 1,000 feet in front of you and expect to hit it. Or I'm just throwing that number out.
It wasn't a sideliner though, where it's going to make these hard turns.
Right. The Sparrow ultimately became a very capable missile.
It moved into the.
But the first we'll get there. But the first generation Sparrow, especially with the F4, I mean, another thing that you'll read about is the radar settling time. These guys would take a radar lock, and they'd have to wait a couple of seconds before the system, you know, either the gyros or the tracking or something like that, before it said, okay, we're tracking the target, we're communicating with the missile, we can talk to the missile, now you can shoot. I mean, that is an eternity in an engagement. And I've read these stories about it, and I go, God. So this is why, so the Phantoms found themselves unable to shoot the enemy in the face before the engagement, so thus they had to merge with them and engage and try to kill them in engagements. Other reasons were, of course, the Vietnamese Air Force, North Vietnam Air Force, was rather wily. You know, they were defending their country, their airspace, and so they would hide in valleys. They would take off from airfields and climb up. You know, they were using everything that they could, asymmetric warfare. The Phantoms did not have a very good kill ratio. I mean, the overall American kill ratio before the bombing hull was only about 2 to 1. And kill ratios are subject, I mean, there's a lot of variables, there's a lot of discrepancies, but let's just say it was 2 to 1. There were other reasons for this. Aircrew training, rules of engagement, the missiles themselves, many times when they were fired, they failed. And there were reasons for that. Sometimes they were fired out of the envelope, other times they'd been mishandled or mistested. And all of these reasons strung together contributed to the poor kill ratio. Now, the Navy addressed this by conducting something called the ALT report. The ALT report was classified secret at the time. Now it's available on the internet.
Oh, wow.
The ALT report had a bunch of great recommendations, and one of those was to develop the Top Gun squadron. They didn't say develop Top Gun, but the ALT report recommendation evolved into Top Gun. Typical bunch of fighter pilots around Miramar, they didn't wait for the ALT report to come out. They knew what the problem was, and so by the late 1960s, some far-reaching visionaries were spending time training Phantom guys how to maneuver. And I've communicated with Randy Cunningham, Duke Cunningham, and his Rio, Willie Driscoll, and they talked about some of these dogfights they went into off Miramar. And Duke remembers them very vividly, and a lot of the guys who were teaching him, they say, yeah, you know, we spent a lot of time teaching Duke how to dogfight, etc. But they're real visionaries. I wrote a magazine article about it a couple of years ago, so for me it was great to contact these guys and you know, and hear their personal stories about how they turned the tide of the air war in Vietnam. What did they do? Some of the basics that they taught the Phantom guys, and this actually goes into this responds to a question that I got when we were preparing for this. Was they told the Phantom guys, fly to your strengths and avoid the enemy's weakness. MiG-17 did not have good control authority up at high speeds. So MiG-17 wanted to stay around probably 0.5 or 0.6 Mach. It had those big wings. It could turn really well, but once it got higher speeds, pilot did not have the strength to maneuver the airplane. On the other hand, a Phantom down at 0.5 or 0.6 Mach is not at its optimum airspeed. It just doesn't have as much G available. So the Phantom guys wanted to stay up around 400 knots, 0.7 or 0.8 Mach. I don't have a lot of time in the Phantom, but I do, you know, I've studied it, I've flown against Phantom guys, etc. So the Phantom guys did not want to get into a slow speed turning engagement with a MiG-17. What did they want to do? They wanted to keep their knots up so they could extend away and then make a hard turn and come back to the fight and possibly get a radar lock and get a missile shot during the engagement. So they could either extend away horizontally, or they want to keep their knots up where they could use the vertical. If you take a jet fighter up in the vertical, and you have a jet fighter going in the vertical, and then you have an opponent in the horizontal here, the guy who's in the horizontal generally is at a disadvantage, because the guy who's in the vertical can roll to keep sight. He's got a transit space in the sky. He just has to roll his airplane to keep sight.
Oh wow, that's a new strategy.
Now, the other thing is, I mean, he's going to be losing energy, losing airspeed. So he can't just sit up there forever and roll around and wait. But he's got a few seconds where he has advantages. Then when he comes down, he's going to be regaining energy, and he's in a position of advantage. On the other hand, if you're this guy and you're defensive, one of the basic defensive moves is oppose the nose. So if you're being threatened by a person attacking you from altitude, you want to oppose the nose. His nose is down, pull your nose up if you have the airspeed to do it.
So you want to increase aspect in that situation. You want to try and keep 90 degrees to them.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I mean, right now I'm just throwing out little tidbits about tactical thought.
But it's so good.
There was
it's so
time,
good.
Thanks, Ben. But as I was preparing for this, I realized that it was 30 years ago that I was a Top Gun instructor, and I used to live this. This was my job. I did it all the time. I don't live it now. I enjoy it, and so I had to dust off some cobwebs and things like that. Okay, so I just talked about F4 versus MiG-17. That's like a third generation versus a second generation fighter, fighter generations. When I think about, some of the guys that are listening to this, they're going to probably be flying either MiG-29 simulations, Su-27s, or 30s, F-16s, F-15s. So if you're in two fourth-generation fighters fighting each other, I just hope there are not a lot of weaknesses in the engaged arena. So I hope your G tolerance is good.
Yeah, it's easy to keep the momentum up when you got jet engines as opposed to props.
Well, that's true too. But I'll tell you what, I do some reading about World War II engagements, and those guys thought of a lot of similar concerns. I mean, it wasn't exactly the same, but I mean, they thought about maintaining energy and high deflection shots and things like that. So there were some tactical similarities. I mean, I'll just throw out a couple more things. One is the American volunteer force, the Flying Tigers in China,
AVG.
Flying the AVG, flying the P-40, an inferior airplane to the Zero. But how did they have success? They used tactics. And you know what? I just segued into my next topic because I talked about the Phantom versus the MiG-17. The Phantom has advantages, but it's forced into the MiG-17's arena, where the MiG-17 is, you could say, the superior aircraft. But then the Phantom triumphed. And the takeaway there is that it's not, that aircrew training can definitely make the difference in an aircrew's success in fighter mission. I'm not that much of a historian, but this goes back to von Richthofen, and he said, it's not the crate, but the man sitting in it. And that is something that the Top Gun school has taught from day one and continues to teach. So there are some good examples in history where tactics, it's not the crate, but the man sitting in it, aircrew training can make the difference. There's some examples where tactics and tactical employment has made a big difference. And Top Gun, when I went through, we were flying F-14s, we're fighting F-5s and A-4s, so we're clearly in the world of jets. This was in 1982 when I went through the class. But on the first day, they talked about aviation history, and they talked about some Spitfires. And the Spitfire was very successful over London in the Battle of Britain. But then in other theaters, I believe the Spitfire did not do very well, and I wish I remembered the details of this, but it was because of tactics. The Spitfires attempted to engage the enemy when they should have been using hit-and-run tactics. That's what the American Volunteer Group did. They did not engage, they used hit-and-run tactics.
That's right.
And something to close the loop with the Vietnam experience, I talked about the kill ratio was about 2-to-1 before the bomb halt. And after the bomb halt, the Navy's kill ratio was about 13-to-1 was what they said, 12-to-1 to 13-to-1. Other sources have revised that down a little bit, but it was still like 8-to-1. And regardless of what the exact number is a significant improvement compared to what it had been before the bombing halt. And the attribution is one of the most significant reasons for this. One of the main reasons for this was Top Gun training and the Navy's aircrew training. As many aircrews as could get through it went through dissimilar air combat training with against A-4 Skyhawks, against F-106s, etc. Back in the early 70s. Okay, let me talk a little bit more about preparation, training preparation. And as I've said, I was a Rio, backseater in the F-14 Tomcat. One of the other areas that we learned was crew coordination. This applies not only in a two-person airplane, but also in a section, flight lead, tactical lead, and wingman situation. The training programs cover a lot of standard procedures. For example, visual hand signals, comm brevity words like yo-yo, joker, bug out, press, etc. All these standard words. So if you only hear one word, you get a lot of information. Another bit of crew coordination, standardization is how to describe a radar picture. You know, if you see two contacts on the radar, and if you see them and they are lined up next to each other, but their velocity vectors are off to the side, do you describe that as a trail or a combat spread, or or echelon formation?
Mm-hmm.
So on your radar, it's going to look like a trail, but you have to use your brain to interpret that. So there's all types of room for standardization, and these things are covered in the training squadrons because the Navy has, they've learned a lot of lessons over the years. Something else that's going to be standardized is in your mission planning. A lot of things such as radar scan volume. Very important when you have two fighters capable radars. You have to make sure that you cover all the scan volume where the threat could be. So make sure that you have a guy looking high and a guy looking low, and you've got good overlap and all these other things.
So you're saying that, and if you don't mind,
go.
If I was flying in DCS with a friend of mine, I would have, if I was flying in the F-14, I would have my radar's azimuth pointed maybe more port side over here, and you would have your radar azimuth maybe looking more starboard so that you were scanning more of the sky?
What we mostly concern scan volume with, and then the F-14 and the Hornet, monitor planes, it's easier for them to look left and right.
Mm-hmm.
And so we worked on an altitude split. So you had a high guy and a low guy.
Oh, okay.
That's what we usually did.
So you had one guy looking up, but he's scanning left and right. And you had another guy looking down, and he's looking left and right.
Yes.
Okay.
Now you could scan, azimuth sectors, but we went altitude. And and that's. I talked to some Hornet guys when I was developing my lecture at the Topgun class when I was an instructor, and we had discussed this in the F-14 training squadron. We discussed it in our fleet squadron, but I thought the new Hornet guys, and they got it from the F-15 pilots, I thought they did a really nice job. And as a RIO, I was, it was a lot of professional pride to say, man, these single seat pilots are doing this very well. But I learned from them.
I can imagine.
So I've talked about in the training programs, talked about mission planning. Something else that mission planning is going to cover is missile launch considerations. And this brings me back to when I was a senior guy in an F-14 squadron. I was the Squadron XO at the time. We had 4 Tomcats going against about 6 adversary Hornets out of Oceania. And this was in 1997. The Hornets were simulating probably fulcrums. Everybody was going to use their longest range missile. They were going to use A-10 Charlies. We were going to use A-54s. And a division of Tomcats, that's a lot of firepower.
Yeah.
So we were out there over the ocean, and this is a bad story about me. We were out there over the ocean. We had an excellent plan for disciplined use of the radars. Everyone's scanning, using the radar, scanning their assigned volume. We're flying in, we're detecting the Hornets. We had a long setup of probably more than 60 miles. It's a nice long setup. And so we're coming in. All the Hornets show up on my radar, and I'm just sitting there and I cannot stand it anymore. So I launched 2 Phoenix at these guys. And as soon as I launched them, my pilot, I was an XO, an 05, a commander, and my pilot was a junior officer, like a Lieutenant JG. He goes, XO, what are you doing? These guys are in LAR. I launched. I don't think we were supposed to do that. And so we came back, and whatever happened, we came back in the debrief. And as soon as the debrief was on the tax range, as soon as the debrief gets started, the adversary lead goes. We've got 4 Tomcats, so that's 8 guys. We've got most of the adversaries there, so we've got about 12 or 15 people in the room in the debriefing on the screen. And the adversary lead goes, So, was anybody else in the room surprised when number 3 launched his missile? And everybody looks at me and I go like, oh God, I guess I should have paid more attention in the brief or something. So, okay, the lesson is pay attention in the brief and follow the plan. Of course, there's going to be times when you have to know when to deviate from the plan. Hey, one thing is, before I go any further, I got a question on email here. How did I become a Rio? I'll just tell you this real quick because I still have some more material I want to cover. How did I become a Rio? When I was about 10 years old, I knew that I wanted to fly jet fighters, and of course, this was around the late 60s, around 1970. I wanted to be a fighter pilot. So I went to college. I went to Navy ROTC, and when I was in college, my eyesight started to go bad. And so this was in 1975, 76, and there was no LASIK. So you had to have 20/20 vision in order to be a pilot. So I was disappointed, but then I looked at my options, and I was very much aware that the Navy was bringing out the F-14. Pilot in front had to have 20/20 vision, but the Rio in the back seat could wear glasses.
You'd be blind as a bat.
So but you had to be correctable to 20/20. So that is why I became a Rio. I wanted to be a pilot, didn't have the eyesight for it, became a Rio.
Have they relaxed those rules?
You know, the rules have changed, but I'm not an expert on it. Okay. So all I'm going to say is talk to your recruiter. Okay, let me get into a couple of questions that I got while I was preparing for this. And one of the questions was a very good question because it goes into the level that I want to discuss today, and that is, what is the wingman's position, and how do you employ a wingman? So before I go any further, I'll talk about the movie Top Gun. I was an instructor at the school when they made the movie. I helped to make it. It was fun, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But the flying scenes in Top Gun were designed for the camera. And actually, I watched part of Top Gun last night. It was on TV.
I watched it just the other day. It's been around.
So the flying scenes were designed for the camera, not for tactical realism. And the second thing is that catch line, never leave your wingman, that was constructed for the plot. Of course, if you have two planes going into combat, which in the Navy we called a section, other people call it a two-ship, you do have to continue to support each other, or both of you can be in big trouble. So never leave your wingman is a good concept, but it doesn't mean fly in formation the entire time you're in an engagement. So the other thing is, as I'm getting started here, I'm not trying to train current generation real fighter pilots and WIZZOs. And I'm also not trying to throw rocks at any other services, because Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, those are the guys that fly tactical jet fighters. Everyone has their strengths or weaknesses, and in history they've made mistakes and done things that have been brilliant. So that's not my point at all. I want to go back though to the Vietnam experience, because from an air combat standpoint, it taught a lot of lessons. Korea was the first air war where we used jet fighters, but in Vietnam we used modern jet fighters that are more similar to what we have now. So something that was tried in Vietnam was type of employment with two aircraft or groups of two airplanes, where the lead, and I'll make the F-14 the lead for this discussion, the lead was the designated attacker. The wingman was in relatively close, 2,500 to 3,000 feet from the lead. 2,500 to 3,000 feet, about a half mile. And the wingman's responsibility was to protect the lead. That was one of his primary responsibilities. So the lead was the attacker, the aggressive, person who was supposed to do most of the fighting.
So you had the guy with the teeth and the guy watching your back.
Yes, that's one way to think about it. A problem with that formation was that the wingman spent a lot of time remaining in formation. 2,500 to 3,000 feet, flying around at 450 knots. Things happen fast, planes are very responsive. He spends a lot of his time not hitting the lead and staying in his proper position. A lot of time, a lot of eyeball time, a lot of brain time working on that. It makes him less able to be tactical, to contribute to a tactical situation. And if the lead is being attacked from outside the formation, the wingman, if he tries to turn into the attacker, he doesn't have much turning room.
He'll go inside him. Okay.
Well, he will spit out of the formation, but he doesn't have a lot of turning room. Now, another option would be to place the wingman about 6,000 feet from the lead.
So a mile.
A mile. There's a lot of benefits to that positioning. One is that the wingman spends a lot less time trying to remain in formation, because if you're at 6,000 feet, you've got more time to react if the lead makes a turn, turns into you, changes altitude, turns away from you, whatever. At 6,000 feet, you've got more time to react. Another is if the lead is attacked from outside the formation, 6,000 feet is about one turn radius, roughly. So the wingman can turn and start to threaten the attacker. He can actually be a true useful wingman and part of the tactical problem.
He can get his weapons around pointing the other guy.
Well said.
Yeah.
The other thing is that philosophy, both aircraft were tactical. It wasn't like one is the shooter and the other guy is the cover. You definitely had a formation lead, a tactical lead, and both airplanes need to understand who has the lead. But they are also both skilled pilots, skilled airplanes who have the permission, have the responsibility to take the fight to the enemy. I dug up a quote from an Air Force pilot. This was an Air Force pilot who was a multiple MiG killer in Vietnam. His name wasn't given, but I could guess who it is. And he said he would rather have 2 airplanes flying that wide formation instead of 4 airplanes in the tight wingman formation. So he'd rather have half the number of airplanes in a better formation. Now, that means that if you have 2 airplanes, you want to decide what formation to put them in. Put them about a mile apart. However, if someone says, would you rather have 4 fighters instead of 2? Say yes. Okay, so let me take another question that came in. And this is about the flat spin in the movie Top Gun. I'm going to start moving faster because we've got a little bit more information to cover. I'll start giving you some shorter answers. The flat spin in the movie Top Gun. Now here's where we're going to shift into the realm of fiction entertainment. Paramount sent the draft script over to the Top Gun Squadron. We reviewed it. They were very open about asking for our assistance and input, and then accepting comments that we made for them. They also told us someone is going to get killed in this movie, and it's not going to be Tom Cruise. So when they first were planning the movie, Paramount wanted to have, they thought of something dramatic, fiery wreckage. They wanted to have a crash on an aircraft carrier. But the Navy, and there's a lot of stock footage of that, there's all kinds of options, but we said, let's not do that. Let's do it during an engagement. And there was a problem with the F-14 where it could actually get into a flat spin. And actually, it's sad to say, but some F-14 aircrews were killed before this was fully realized, and before people figured out, how to counter it. Because the first few times it happened, the aircrew was not adequately prepared to counter it, and if you don't get right on it and fix it, you have very little chance of surviving. So let's go into the slow speed flight regime. I'm going to suspect that a lot of people who are watching this are familiar, or at least have heard of the fact that the F-14A with the TF-30 engines, the engines were not that good. Let's just put it mildly. There were some reasons. They were turbofan engines. They put afterburners on them. First, they were incredible. And then as they started to be used more, the weaknesses started to emerge. And one of the weaknesses was at certain regimes, if you had turbulent airflow coming into the intakes, it could interrupt the airflow and cause the engine to stall. And if you're in full Zone 5 afterburner with these engines are, I believe they were 9 feet apart, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
If you're in full Zone 5 afterburner and you lose thrust in one engine, the other engine is going to drive the plane into a spin.
Okay. In which case you can't get the nose down.
Right, you've got to work fast to make things happen.
There was that much thrust difference.
Oh yeah. Especially when the F-14 was brand new, the engines were at their full power.
Yeah.
Because later they were detuned to make this situation less likely. So a bunch of things are going on. The engines were at full power. When the airplane was flying, going 200, 300 knots, due to ram effect, they created more thrust than the 20,000 pounds you're familiar with.
Yes.
I've looked for a chart on that. I can't find one, but ram effect affects that supports all jet engines. So the F-14 could get into a flat spin. Air crews were lost because they got into a spin. They could not reach the ejection handles. They didn't have their straps tight enough, or they were incapacitated because the plane quickly started spinning very fast. During a test of the F-14's spin recovery, and there's a video of this, or we saw a video when we were in training. They went to high altitude. They intentionally put it into a spin. This was a test crew, test pilot, test Rio. They intentionally put it into a spin. They could not get out of the spin. So as they descended through, I think it was 18,000, 16,000 feet, they ejected. The Rio pulled the handle, the canopy came off, but due to the airflow, the canopy hung up above the plane, and when the Rio seat fired, the Rio hit the canopy and he broke his leg.
His leg?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, we all knew that because it caused a modification of the ejection procedure. If you're in a spin and you're going to eject, jettison the canopy first, wait a moment, and just that fraction of a second will give the canopy time to get cleared before you eject. But we said if the Rio forgets to do that, he could hit his head on the canopy, could cause a fatal injury. So that's how Goose got killed.
Oh, okay. That's a good story.
Okay, another story is, let me talk a little bit about squadron life. Moving to a different topic. We were very professional. I'll talk about an F-14 squadron. People have asked me this since the book has come out, and I've talked to more people. They talk about pilot and Rio relations, and there were some people, some pilots who just did not want to fly with a Rio. Very, very few though. And for guys like that, I mean, I don't think I ever dealt with any, but I was aware of this, and so I always tried to earn my way into that cockpit. I wanted to make myself worthwhile, make the pilot happy that I was there. I didn't put myself there. I didn't design the F-14 with 2 seats, but I was in that seat. I wanted to make myself worthwhile. There were also Rios who probably resented the fact that they were not pilots. So it works both ways. But those are the exceptions. Most of the people that I worked with said, hey, we're flying F-14s. There's a pilot, there's a Rio. I'm a pilot or I'm a Rio, whichever. This is my part. Now, that's in the professional aviation, professionalism. You also had to have good communications between the air crews so that you could be effective tactically. But when you're on the ground, a lot of squadrons would have, pilot versus Rio softball games and things like that. Or if there was a competition, sometimes you divide up into pilots or Rios, but it wasn't always pilots versus Rios because a squadron has a tactical organization. So you could have, 4 plane divisions, and you could have the divisions opposing each other, challenging each other. When I was in Top Gun, as a Top Gun instructor, we were very professional when we were around the class, when we were conducting our classes and when we were flying against the class. Top Gun had very high standards, and instructors were expected to meet them. And when I became an instructor, that was probably the hardest I've worked in my certainly in my aviation career, but also it was the most rewarding. I was very proud to be a Top Gun instructor, and I wanted to earn my way onto that team. But sometimes we had fun. For example, there was one time, leading into this, there was a time when a pilot and Rio were both leaving the squadron at the same time, and so they went out to take their last flight. And everybody there, we were working hard, getting ready for a class or something, and we were saying, just get out of here, you guys. We're tired of you. You're leaving, so just get out of here. So they went out and they manned up an F-5F and went out over the Pacific to take their last flight. Now, about 5 minutes after they walked out of the training room, there were 3 other pilots sitting in there, and I was in there too, but there were 3 other pilots in there, and they go, we can't just let these guys just get out of here. So somebody called the maintenance department and said, hey, do you have 3 F-5Es available? And they said, yeah. So I go, okay, keep it quiet, but right after these guys leave, we're going to come down and man up, and we're going to go surprise them. And so this was one of the best executed operations I've ever seen. We knew exactly what it took to man up, get going out of the line, who they would talk to on the radio. So as these guys put their gear on, as soon as they left the gear room and walked downstairs, the 3 guys went into the gear room and they got their gear. As soon as the departing crew left the maintenance and walked out to the jet, the next 3 guys went and they read the book and signed for their jets. As soon as the departing crew left the flight line, the next 3 guys went out and manned up. And they trailed them on the radio, so they didn't hear any radio calls. They waited until they checked off a frequency before they would check in and all this other stuff. So the departing guys were out there over the ocean just having a happy time, thinking they were flying by themselves, and all of a sudden they've got 3 F-5s rolling in on them, calling guns. So, we had fun whenever we could. It was a wonderful experience. I hate to use the word wonderful, but it was a great experience, man. Especially when you're 26, 27 years old, flying jet fighters, being a Top Gun instructor. Okay, running low on questions. I've got dozens here, and I'll come up to one. So Ben, you can think of one more question because we'll have just a minute at the end. But go ahead.
Can I think of a question?
No, you could think of one. Here, pick one of those.
One of these.
But before we get to that, you pick one, and I may not answer it, but I'll give you the choice to. If I don't answer one, then I'll go to another. One thing I want to do. Hold that. Let me do this. Let me do this segment. This is something it's an aviation book. I just want to introduce this book. This does not benefit me. I want to call this to the attention of enthusiasts in the audience. And this is a book that I recently read. I'll hold it up a little bit better. You can find it. This is a book that I recently read. It's called Clashes. It's by Michel, M-I-C-H-E-L, III. It is an analysis of Vietnam air combat, and it is a fantastic collection of stories, lessons, analysis, etc. So if you're looking for an aviation book, that's one that I recommend that you read. Okay, Ben, you're on.
All right, Dave. How did the fire start that one time?
Oh, that question.
Is that a good one or you want to know?
That's a hard one. I'll just tell you, it was the only time I was in an airplane that had a fire was ECS, environmental control system, turbine.
The actual air conditioning in the aircraft.
Yeah. And F-14s had been lost due to fires started by the ECS turbine. So I was flying across the country, deploying from Oceana to Miramar, operational, not fooling around, and we lost our ECS. We had a screeching sound. We started to have heat in the cockpit. And so we declared an emergency. We turned off the ECS. We told our wingman follow us. Wingman, I can't say wingman. Told our wingman to follow us. And the pilot and I prepared for ejection. Because what happens is, if there's a fire, one, your plane is on fire. Two, it can burn through control systems. And if it burns through control systems, you cannot continue to fly the plane.
Yeah.
There's no benefit to stay in there. Luckily, we landed. We were able to land in somewhere in Oklahoma. I don't think it was Tinker. Could have been Tulsa. Anyways, we landed somewhere in the central United States. This is one of the few times I don't remember that detail. We got out of the plane. I put my hand on the side. I could not, the plane was so hot, I couldn't hold my hand there. This was the outside skin. So, I mean, we were very lucky that we were able to get the plane on the ground before a fire, broke out or got bigger.
Are you dumping air from the engines as part of the
turbine,
or was it?
The turbine did pull air out of the engines, but the reason it also actually had an external inlet, and there was a mixer to combine them. But the reason that there was the heat and fire was the bearing failure.
A bearing failure.
Yeah.
Okay. Of the turbine itself. Okay.
So what I did was, at this time I was the commanding officer of the squadron, and I went over to the wingman and I told that Rio, I go, sorry, you're staying here with this airplane. I need to get to San Diego. San Diego. But it was good. The whole squadron was going to San Diego to deploy, and I needed to be there. And the wingman, they got a replacement airplane, and they came out to San Diego a couple of days later. You also asked about Victor Belenko.
Yes.
If
you have a moment,
I will talk about Victor Belenko, but a lot of the things that I've talked about in here, I'm going to give a plug to my book in case anybody's wondering. Top Gun Days is a book that I wrote about my experiences in my first F-14 squadron and as a Top Gun instructor. One of the stories in there was meeting Victor Belenko, the Russian, Soviet at the time pilot who flew a Foxbat to Japan in the 1970s. He and defected. He came to the United States. He used to give lectures at the Top Gun class. I had a friend who connected me with him, and so I was his contact at the squadron. And he was a very interesting person to talk to. He was a great fighter pilot to hang out with, and it was very interesting. He told us things about the Soviet Union. That's what defectors do. He had a idealistic reason for leaving the Soviet Union, and in fact, he wrote a book about it that talked about how he came to that decision to leave the Soviet Union. It wasn't something that he did lightly. He just believed that the United States was the place to be. And it's a sensitive subject. I understand, to this day, some people don't like him. I understand that. I have no contact with the man. I don't have any connection to him anymore, and it was more than 30 years ago. But he was an interesting person to deal with. No, we weren't intimidated by the stuff that he told us. We had good intelligence. He confirmed and emphasized certain things. He shed a little light on other things, and so it just helped to complete the picture for our preparation in case we went into that combat, and that would have been terrible if the United States had gone into combat with the Soviet Union. Of course, two huge superpowers. Nobody wants to see that. So at that point, now we're running up at the 1 hour mark. I'm going to stick to my promise, and this is a good thing about execution is fly the plan. I will say that based on the response we get and based on how this thing goes, we'll probably do this again in about 2 months. It'll be on the Twitch channel, or people can search can go to my website, which is right down here, and we'll have information on that. So thank you for the attention. Thanks for joining us today. I'd also like to thank Ben and the tech support team for making this happen. And the last thing I'll say is Tomcats forever.
Thank you so much, Dave. I can't thank
Sure
you
thing.
enough for coming over here.